Welcome to Introduction to iPhone Development here on TechPub with Ben Sherman. Today's episode is episode number 7, Navigation. How to get those screens to fly left and right, change titles, all those good things. Going to be taking a look at the tab control as well as the UI navigation controller. I'll warn you now, these concepts are not exactly simple, so hang on tight. Here we go.
Hello and welcome to the TechPub iPhone series. I'm your host, Ben Sherman. Today we're going to be taking a look at the navigation controller and the tab bar controller. Both of these are view controller containers that can help you manage displaying and arranging a series of view controllers. So we'll start off with the navigation controller, which you're probably already familiar with. In the navigation controller scenario, you will tap on something in one view controller. It will add a new view controller sliding in from the right, and subsequently you can tap on another view controller or another item. It will slide in another view controller from the right hand side, and you can tap in the back button and the back button again to get back to your root view controller. So how does that work? The UI navigation controller has a view controller property, so it always points to a view controller, and sometime down the line you will call push view controller animated on the navigation controller in order to add a new view controller onto what's called the navigation controller stack. So you're pushing a view controller onto the stack. So now the navigation controller is pointing to the new view controller, and it behaves just like any other stack. So say we have a stack of view controllers, and the user pushes the back button, it will pop a view controller off of the stack and deallocate it, and will be sitting at the one previous. Since the navigation bar will be visible throughout most of our application, a lot of people choose to customize the look and feel. We can customize the tint color, an optional image instead of the text in the center. The center examples from the groceries app, that one has a custom texture applied to the whole navigation bar, and you can also add bar button items, which are those buttons on the left and the right hand side. The one on the left is called a left bar button item, and the one on the right is called a right bar button item. The one on the left is generally reserved for the back button, but if you're sitting at the root view controller, there's never going to be a back button there, so you do have the opportunity to put a button for yourself there. The one on the right is generally used for actions that you're going to perform on the view controller. Here's a snippet of code that you might use to create a right bar button item. You can do an interface builder as well, but this is the code way. You call self.navigationItem.right bar button item, and you would initialize that to a new UI bar button item instance. You could also set the title from your view controller. You would call in your view did load, you would call self.title equals my custom title, and that would control both the text that is displayed in the center of the the navigation bar when that view controller is visible, as well as the back button. When you push a new view controller onto the stack, the back button text will be equal to that text as well. Okay, next up is the UI tab bar controller, and you're probably already familiar with that as well. It controls tabs at the bottom of the screen, each pointing to a view controller, and you can swap between them at will. Each tab has an icon, an optional badge, and some text. Now, the structure of UI tab bar controller is slightly different from the UI navigation controller in that it has a collection of view controllers instead of a stack. And the collection of view controllers that it has, all of them are active at the same time. So when a UI tab bar controller is created, all of the view controllers that it has a reference to are also initialized and created at that time. In addition, the view did load of each view controller is called. And so if you have some complex initialization logic that needs to happen on view did load, just be aware that you'll pay the price for that when the UI tab bar controller is loaded. So if there's complex logic for all three of these, you'll pay the price for that at the same time. You can also take advantage of view will appear and view will disappear as the user switches between the tabs. Now, if you have more than 5 tabs across the bottom, they don't actually fit. So what the behavior is, and they give this for you for free, is add a more tab at the very end, and then that will point to a list of additional tabs that couldn't fit on the screen. So in the iPod application, you see there's well over 10. And if you hit the edit button, you can actually configure and reorder and rearrange these tabs to see which ones are visible on the screen at any point in time, which is very helpful, and it's cool that this is included. You can, of course, turn this behavior off if it's not appropriate for your application, but it is nice that they include it. Okay, designing tab bar icons. You'll eventually probably need to talk to a designer and ask them for a tab bar icon, and a lot of designers who are not familiar with iPhone will try to create a gradient looking tab icon for you, and that's actually not necessary. All you need is an image that's roughly 30 by 30. It doesn't necessarily have to be square, but just no bigger than that. And it needs to be an alpha transparent PNG. So basically there's only an alpha channel. And the reason is the iPhone OS is actually going to apply a gradient for you, both when in the unselected and selected state. So when you're looking at one of these icons in, say, Photoshop, it's just going to look like black and transparent. Or you can just take a look at some of the work that other people have done. At Glyphish.com, they give away a pack of tab bar icons for free, which is very generous. They give you PSDs for these, and there's a wide range of different icons that you can use. I believe that you need to give attribution to them in order to use these in your applications. So definitely take a look at the license there. But this is a great resource to see how to design them. A lot of people, it's very common actually, to mix tab bar controllers and navigation controllers. And if you do it incorrectly, you'll get some quirky behaviors. This is the intended way of nesting it, where UI tab bar controller is the root of your entire application, and it contains view controllers. Now, one of those view controllers, or more of those view controllers, can be navigation controllers. So notice how we have a navigation controller nested inside of a tab bar controller. And that navigation controller has a stack of view controllers. So the behavior would actually preserve your position in that navigation controller stack, even if the user swaps between tabs. If you were to do the reverse, it would be quite awkward navigation, and there's very few cases where that's appropriate. So make sure you follow the Apple's human interface guidelines here and use your tab bar controller as the root of your project. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of this navigation bar controller. Now, we could choose this navigation-based application, but that would basically do all the hard work for you, and you would be left not really understanding what's going on. So instead, we're going to choose a more basic view-based application, and we're going to build up to that. In the future, once you know how things are working, you may just choose to go straight for a navigation-based application, but it's always good to know what type of code these templates are creating for you. So we're going to start with this very basic view-based application, and we're going to call this nav. Let's go ahead and build and run this and see what we have. And you can see we'd have just a plain basic gray screen. Not very interesting. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can change this up so that it uses a navigation controller instead. Now, if you remember from before, we have a mainwindow.xib, which is basically a root nib folder, a root nib file. This controls a bunch of things about how our application is going to get created. The file's owner is UI application. It has an app delegate. It already created a root view controller for us, and it has a window. So what we want to do is, instead of creating this nav demo view controller, we want it to create our navigation controller. So over here in the library on the left, I'm going to drag a navigation controller over to this pane here. So that goes ahead and creates it for us, but we need to wire it up to be used as part of this application. Now, to do that, this app delegate is actually pointing to a view controller, as you can see up here. But currently it's pointed directly to this nav demo view controller. So if we break that connection here, we could try to connect this over to this navigation controller, but you notice it's not highlighting, meaning we can't make that connection. And the reason is, if we go into our code and we pop open this app delegate header file, notice that our view controller property and instance variable are hard-coded to this nav demo view controller. We could choose to use a more laxed UI view controller type here. And if we were to do that, everything still works because it still uses the UI view controller base class. We go back into Interface Builder, and now we can drag from view controller over to navigation controller. So now we've made that our root. And if we expand this, we notice the navigation controller has its own view controller. But we don't really want that. We just want to use this nav demo view controller here. So you just drag that so it's underneath the navigation controller. Now one thing that will help is when you're looking over here in this pane, try not to stay in this mode because it's really hard to see what's going on. I always like to stay in list so that you can actually see the hierarchy of these view controllers. So now we have our designer here. This view controller was loading from a different nib file, but we do have our navigation bar at the top, so I can call this nav demo. And we can save it. I'm going to go ahead and quit Interface Builder. And now let's run our application. And notice we have our nav demo at the top. This bar here is coming from our navigation controller, but this gray view was our initial view controller from before. So I'm going to go ahead and add a button to that. If we go over to our nib file for nav demo view controller, we can go over here and add a button. We'll call it push me. Go ahead and save that. And in our nav demo view controller header file, let's go ahead and add a IB action. For push me tapped. And for now, I'll just put an empty implementation. Hop back into Interface Builder. And we will drag from our view controller, push me tapped, there we go. Make that connection. Now push me tapped is going to get called. What we want to do is we want to add a second view controller. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a new UI view controller. This time we'll use a table view controller subclass. And that's pretty standard. A lot of table view controllers sort of go hand in hand with UI navigation controller because a lot of times you're drilling down across series of data. I'll call this second view controller. And we've got to fill in a couple of things here. We'll just say that it has no sections and no data. Okay, now in our nav demo view controller, when push me is tapped, we want to create an instance of this second view controller. Give it a table view style of plain, and then we're going to call a method on our navigation controller. Now every view controller has a self.navigation controller property. Now this will be nil for cases where you're not embedded inside of a navigation controller already. But in our case we are, so navigation controller will point to our parent nav controller. And now we can call a method on this, push view controller animated. So we'll pass in our controller and animated yes. You might use no here if you wanted to construct a navigation controller stack from a previous instance. So say, for example, your application is running and the user turns off their phone or crashes or whatever. If you were to be persisting the state of their navigation, then the next time they launch, you could try to recreate their stack. And in that case, you would not want to use animation. And now that the navigation controller is hanging on to this view controller, we don't need to hang on to it anymore, and we can release our copy. Let's go ahead and build. Now we hit push me, and our second view controller comes into play here. Now notice I can click the back button. It takes the same title here as the title here. Now this one doesn't have a title, and since we're not working with a nib in the second controller, go ahead and work with our custom a code-based method of using a title. Say self.title. And now it says second view controller. Now notice we have this problem where nav demo is a little bit wide and second view controller is a little bit too wide as well. So what if we had our nav demo just be an empty space where you just have the back button but with no text in it? How would we control that? Now it turns out it's a little bit non-intuitive. There's two ways. One of them's a little bit hacky and one's the way that is intended. So I'm going to show you that one. Inside of the nav demo view controller in our view did load, you need to customize the back button as if you were about to be pushing a controller. So for example, the back button customization happens on the controller that will be displayed when the back button is pushed. So it doesn't go on the controller that's visible at that point in time. So if we want a custom back button pointing to nav demo view controller, then we need to customize that back button on nav demo view controller. Clear as mud, right? Okay, let's get started. So we can set up a navigation item dot back bar button item to a new UI bar button item. And this has a few things here: bar button, system item, target, and action. Actually, this is the one I want. Title, style, action. So the title is just going to be a space. Style is going to be UI bar button item style bordered. Target is going to be nil. Action is going to be nil. And the reason is that the navigation controller will handle that for me. Okay, so we've created our back bar button item, and so what's going to happen is when I'm viewing a pushed view controller, it's going to look at the previous view controller, pull out this back bar button item, and add it to the navigation bar while that frontmost view controller is visible. So that's why it's a little bit confusing that we add the back button item on the previous view controller. And if we do that now, we get a smaller back button, and we can actually display this full text here. So that's the navigation controller. It's pretty straightforward. We could add some more rows here, and as you tap on a row, it would push a third view controller in the list. But the general idea is the same, and it will control the memory for you. So when you hit the back button, the second view controller will actually get disposed of at that point. So let's implement our tab bar controller inside of this existing application, which is something that you'll tend to do a lot when you're starting out and trying out different view controller techniques. So we already have a navigation bar controller working, but we're going to nest this inside of a tab bar controller. So let's go ahead and open up Interface Builder, and we're going to drag a tab bar controller from the library over here. And we're going to do a similar thing where our navdemo.app delegate is pointing to this navigation controller as its view controller. So we're going to change that by making the connection to tab bar controller instead. Now if we open that up, so notice the tab bar controller has our two things here. We're going to just drag our navigation controller inside of there. And we can make it our first view controller if we want to by just reordering it here. Now notice that created a tab bar item for us, so we'll actually notice we've got a tab bar item in here. If we click on it the first time, notice we're actually still pointing to something else here, the UI navigation controller. If I click again, I get the tab bar item. And so that's how we can change these attributes. I can give it a badge if I want to. Say if I say 1 here, it's going to give the badge of 1. And you can change your identifier here to bookmarks or something. And for this one, we'll go ahead and change that one to history. You could also add an image for these, which is how you would do your own custom one. And notice that I can just flip between these now. Now we'll save that and we'll go back into Xcode, rebuild it, and run it. It's a little cut off at the bottom there, but you can see that now we've got our 3 tabs across the bottom, and notice that it's just swapping between view controllers. If I push this one, we're sitting on second view controller, I can swap over to another tab. When I go back, I'm exactly where I left off, which is the expected behavior. And one last thing to note is that if you're using a toolbar, toolbars generally go on the bottom, but if you're using a tab bar, it's actually recommended to not use a toolbar, because you get into the state where if I've got a button here in the middle and I accidentally, instead of clicking the button, I hit history, then it just sort of takes you completely away from where you are. And there's a couple of examples of this on the store. Occasionally apps get slipped through the cracks and they're approved, and you'll notice that their behavior is really quirky. So just don't put a toolbar at the bottom if you're using a tab bar. And that's it. That's actually a pretty common scenario where you will nest a navigation controller inside of a tab bar controller, and we'll use that to contain multiple view controllers. Well, that's it for this time. We'll see you next time.